Atlanta in the summer of 1979 was a city on the rise, a metropolis that had branded itself as the city too busy to hate, a shining example of the New South where racial progress and economic prosperity were supposed to be creating a model for American urban life. The city had elected its first black mayor, Maynard Jackson, in 1973. The metropolitan area was growing rapidly. Fortune 500 companies were relocating their headquarters to Atlanta. The city was positioning itself to host the 1996 Summer Olympics. Everything seemed possible. And then the children began to disappear. On July 28, 1979, the bodies of two boys were found in the woods near Niskey Lake Road in southwest Atlanta. Edward Hope Smith, 14 years old, and Alfred James Evans, 13 years old, had both been reported missing in the previous days. They had been shot and their bodies hidden in the undergrowth, discovered by a couple searching for aluminum cans to recycle. The murders were initially treated as isolated incidents, tragic but not indicative of any pattern. Atlanta, like any major city, had its share of violence. Two dead teenagers were a horror, but they didn't necessarily suggest a serial killer. But the disappearances continued. Milton Harvey, 14, vanished on September 4, 1979. His body was found weeks later. Yusef Bell, 9 years old, disappeared on October 21, 1979. His body was found in an abandoned school. Angel Lennaire, 12, was found dead in March 1980. Jeffrey Mathies, 10, disappeared in March 1980 and was never found. By the spring of 1980, the city was beginning to understand that something unprecedented was happening. Children were disappearing from Atlanta's black neighborhoods with terrifying regularity. The victims were primarily boys, primarily young, primarily from poor or working-class families. They would vanish from streets, from parks, from shopping centers, sometimes in broad daylight. Their bodies would be found days or weeks later in wooded areas, in rivers, in vacant buildings, strangled or suffocated or beaten to death. The terror was specific and targeted. White children were not disappearing. The murders were happening almost exclusively in Atlanta's black communities, in neighborhoods that were already struggling with poverty and limited resources. Parents stopped letting their children play outside. Schools organized buddy systems and safety programs. Neighborhoods formed patrols. But the killings continued. By the summer of 1981, when the case finally broke, at least 28 young people had been murdered or had disappeared and were presumed dead. The list of names was unbearable. Edward Smith, Alfred Evans, Milton Harvey, Yusef Bell, Angel Lennaire, Jeffrey Mathies, Eric Middlebrooks, Christopher Richardson, LaTanya Wilson, Aaron Witch, Anthony Carter, Earl Terrell, Clifford Jones, Darren Glass, Charles Stevens, Aaron Jackson, Patrick Rogers, Luby Getter, Terry Pugh, Patrick Baltazar, Curtis Walker, Joseph Bell, Timothy Hill, Eddie Duncan, Larry Rogers, Michael McIntosh, Jimmy Ray Payne, William Barrett. 28 names, 28 families destroyed, a city traumatized, and one man, Wayne Bertram Williams, arrested and convicted of 2 murders, blamed for most or all of the rest, but never tried for the child killings, maintaining his innocence for over 40 years. This is the story of the Atlanta child murders, one of the most controversial and painful cases in American criminal history. This is the story of 28 victims who deserve to live. This is the story of a city that has never fully healed from its darkest period. These are the fatal headlines. Part 1. The City of Hope BCOMES, the City of Fear. Atlanta in 1979 was a city conscious of its image and its trajectory. Unlike many southern cities that had resisted integration violently, Atlanta had managed the civil rights era with relatively less bloodshed, carefully cultivating an image as a progressive, business-friendly metropolis where black and white residents could prosper together. The slogan, "The City Too Busy to Hate," reflected both aspiration and strategic marketing. Atlanta wanted to be the capital of the New South, and racial harmony was good for business. The city's black middle class was substantial and growing. Atlanta was home to several historically black colleges and universities: Morehouse, Spelman, Clark Atlanta, Morris Brown, that educated black students from across the country. The city had elected Maynard Jackson as its first black mayor in 1973, followed by Andrew Young in 1981. Black Atlantans held positions of power in city government, in business, in cultural institutions. For many African American families, Atlanta represented opportunity and progress. But beneath this image of prosperity and racial harmony, poverty and inequality persisted. The city's poor black neighborhoods on the south and west sides struggled with inadequate schools, limited job opportunities, deteriorating infrastructure, and crime. The gap between Atlanta's aspirational image and the lived reality of its poorest residents was substantial. It was from these poorer neighborhoods that the victims of the Atlanta child murders came. Most were children of working-class or poor families, living in communities where parents worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, where children had significant independence out of necessity, where the social safety net was thin. The first two victims, Edward Hope Smith and Alfred James Evans, were found together on July 28, 1979. Edward, nicknamed E.H., was 14 and had been shot. Alfred, 13, had been shot as well. Their bodies were discovered in a wooded area off Niskey Lake Road in southwest Atlanta by a couple looking for recyclable cans. The murders were initially investigated as isolated incidents, possibly gang-related or the result of a dispute between teenagers. But the circumstances were disturbing. Two young boys, killed execution style, their bodies hidden in the woods. The families demanded answers. The police investigation proceeded slowly. Milton Harvey, 14, disappeared on September 4, 1979, from a bank parking lot where his mother had dropped him off to cash a check. His skeletal remains were found in November in a wooded area in East Point, a suburb just south of Atlanta. Yusef Ali Bell, 9 years old, disappeared on October 21, 1979. He had been sent on an errand to a neighborhood store and never returned. His body was found on November 8 in the crawl space of an abandoned elementary school, strangled with a cord. Yusef was small for his age, cherubic in photographs, a child who should have been safe in his own neighborhood. The discovery of Yusef's body was a turning point. This was not a teenager involved in risky behavior. This was a 9-year-old child sent to the store by his mother, murdered and hidden in an abandoned building. Yusef's mother, Camille Bell, would become one of the most vocal advocates for the victims' families, demanding police attention and resources, refusing to let the city ignore what was happening. Angel Lanier, 12 years old, was found dead on March 10, 1980. Her body had been tied to a tree, hands bound behind her back, sexually assaulted and strangled. The brutality of Angel's murder shocked investigators and the public. This was not a quick killing. This was prolonged terror inflicted on a child. Jeffrey Lamar Mathies, 10 years old, disappeared on March 11, 1980, the day after Angel's body was found. Jeffrey has never been found, his case remaining unsolved. His family left with no closure, no body to bury, just the agonizing knowledge that he vanished and likely died during Atlanta's season of terror. By spring 1980, the pattern was undeniable. Children and teenagers were disappearing and dying in Atlanta's black communities at a rate that was statistically impossible to explain as coincidence. The victims shared characteristics. They were young, black, primarily male, from working-class neighborhoods. They disappeared from streets and public places. Their bodies, when found, showed signs of strangulation, asphyxiation, or blunt force trauma. The Atlanta Police Department, initially reluctant to acknowledge a serial killer, finally established a task force in the summer of 1980. But the task force was understaffed, underfunded, and overwhelmed by the scope of the investigation. New victims appeared faster than old cases could be investigated. Leads multiplied but led nowhere. The city was in crisis. Parents in black neighborhoods lived in a state of constant fear. Children were kept inside after school. Those who had to go out were accompanied by adults. The ordinary freedoms of childhood, playing outside, walking to a friend's house, running errands alone, became too dangerous to allow. The city's playgrounds emptied. The streets that had once been full of children became eerily quiet. And the killer or killers continued to operate with apparent impunity. Part 2. The victims. The list of victims in the Atlanta child murders eventually reached 28 names, though there is debate about which cases should be included and whether some were the work of different perpetrators. What follows is the official list as recognized by the Atlanta Police Department and the FBI, with the understanding that each name represents not just a statistic but a child or young person whose life mattered. Edward Hope Smith, 14 years old, disappeared July 21, 1979. Found July 28, 1979. Shot to death. Alfred James Evans, 13 years old, disappeared July 25, 1979. Found July 28, 1979 with Edward Smith. Shot to death. Milton Harvey, 14 years old, disappeared September 4, 1979. Found November 16, 1979. Cause of death undetermined due to decomposition. Yusef Ali Bell, 9 years old, disappeared October 21, 1979. Found November 8, 1979 in abandoned school. Strangled. Angel Lenner, 12 years old, found dead March 10, 1980. Hands tied behind back, sexually assaulted, strangled. Angel was one of the few female victims. Jeffrey Lamar Mathies, 10 years old, disappeared March 11, 1980. Never found, officially missing. Eric Antonio Middlebrooks, 14 years old, found May 19, 1980. Head trauma, hit and run. Christopher Paul Richardson, 12 years old, disappeared June 9, 1980. Found June 27, 1980. Asphyxiated. Latanya Yvette Wilson, 7 years old, disappeared June 22, 1980 from her home. Never found. The youngest victim and one of the few girls. Aaron Witch, 10 years old, disappeared June 23, 1980. Found June 24, 1980. Asphyxiated. Anthony Bernard Carter, 9 years old, disappeared July 7, 1980. Found July 8, 1980 in Niskey Lake, stabbed. Earl Lee Terrell, 11 years old, disappeared July 30, 1980. Found August 9, 1980. Asphyxiated. Clifford Emmanuel Jones, 13 years old, disappeared August 20, 1980. Found October 18, 1980. Strangled. Darren Lamar Glass, 10 years old, disappeared September 14, 1980. Never found. Charles T. Stevens, 12 years old, disappeared October 9, 1980. Found October 10, 1980. Asphyxiated. Aaron Jr. Witch, 11 years old, different person from Aaron Witch listed earlier though same first name. Disappeared October 21, 1980. Found November 1, 1980. Cause undetermined. Anthony Bernard Carter, 9 years old, disappeared November 2, 1980. Found November 3, 1980. Cause undetermined. Patrick Rogers, sometimes listed as Pale Rogers, 16 years old, disappeared November 10, 1980. Found December 20, 1980. Asphyxiated. Luby Chuck Getter, 14 years old, disappeared January 3, 1981. Found February 5, 1981. Strangled. Terry Lorenzo Pugh, 15 years old, disappeared January 23, 1981. Found February 15, 1981. Strangled. Patrick Baltazar, 12 years old, sometimes listed as 11, disappeared February 6, 1981. Found February 13, 1981. Strangled, ligature marks. Curtis Walker, 13 years old, disappeared February 19, 1981. Found March 6, 1981. Asphyxiated. Joseph Jojo Bell, 16 years old, not related to Yusef Bell, disappeared March 2, 1981. Found April 19, 1981. Asphyxiated. Timothy Hill, 13 years old, disappeared March 13, 1981. Found March 30, 1981. Asphyxiated. Eddie Bubba Duncan, 21 years old, disappeared March 20, 1981. Found April 10, 1981. Strangled. One of the older victims. Larry Eugene Rogers, 20 years old, disappeared March 30, 1981. Found April 9, 1981. Asphyxiated. Another older victim. Michael Anthony McIntosh, 23 years old, sometimes listed as 24, disappeared May 15, 1981. Found June 25, 1981. Asphyxiated. The oldest victim on the official list. Jimmy Ray Payne, 21 years old, disappeared April 22, 1981. Found April 27, 1981. Asphyxiated. William Barrett, 17 years old, disappeared May 11, 1981. Found May 12, 1981. Strangled. 28 victims over approximately 2 years. The ages ranged from 7 LaTanya Wilson to 23 Michael McIntosh. Most were children between 9 and 15. Most were boys. Most died from asphyxiation or strangulation. Most came from Atlanta's poorest black neighborhoods. Each of these children and young people had families who loved them, friends who missed them, futures that were stolen. Yusef Bell's mother, Camille, became a powerful voice for the families, organizing, demanding action, refusing to let the city forget her son or the others. Many of the families would spend decades seeking answers, seeking justice, seeking closure that would never fully come. The disappearances created terror that extended beyond the immediate families. Every parent in Black Atlanta lived with the fear that their child might be next. Every child understood that playing outside, walking to school, going to the store carried risks that white children in other parts of the city didn't face. The murders were a wound to the entire community, a violation of the basic sense of safety that makes normal life possible. Part 3. The investigation and the politics. The Atlanta Police Department's response to the murders was, from the beginning, complicated by politics, race, and resource constraints. The department was headed by Police Chief Lee Brown, an African American with a Ph.D. in criminology, operating under Mayor Maynard Jackson, also African American. Both men were acutely aware that the case had racial dimensions that could easily spiral into accusations and counter-accusations. The initial reluctance to acknowledge a serial killer was partly about not wanting to panic the city, but it was also about Atlanta's image. Admitting that a serial killer was targeting black children would damage the city's carefully cultivated reputation as a progressive, safe, economically vibrant metropolis. It would drive away business investment. It would undermine the narrative of the New South that Atlanta's leadership had spent years building. But as the body count rose and the families of victims organized and demanded action, the city could no longer avoid acknowledging the crisis. In the summer of 1980, a special task force was created, eventually growing to include personnel from the Atlanta Police Department, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and various suburban police departments whose jurisdictions had also been affected. The task force faced extraordinary challenges. They were investigating potentially 28 separate murders and disappearances spread across 2 years and multiple jurisdictions. They had limited forensic evidence. Many bodies were too decomposed to yield useful physical evidence by the time they were found. They had few witnesses. The victims had disappeared from streets and public places without anyone seeing anything useful. They had no obvious suspect pool. The killer could be anyone. The FBI's involvement brought additional resources and expertise, but it also brought tension. Some in Atlanta's black community viewed the FBI with suspicion, remembering COINTELPRO and the Bureau's history of targeting civil rights leaders. The question of whether the FBI could be trusted to investigate murders of black children was real and legitimate. The investigation was also hampered by theories and speculation that sometimes obscured the evidence. Some people believed the Ku Klux Klan was responsible, conducting a campaign of racial terrorism against black children. This theory had some surface plausibility. The KKK had a long history of violence against black communities, and all the victims were black. But the FBI found no evidence of Klan involvement, no chatter in white supremacist circles about the murders, no claims of responsibility. Others believed a pedophile ring was operating in Atlanta, abducting children for exploitation and killing them to cover the crimes. This theory led to investigation of various individuals known to have histories of sexual offenses against children, but no evidence emerged connecting any of them to the murders. Still others believed the killings were being committed by multiple perpetrators operating independently, that the supposed pattern was really several different patterns that happened to overlap in time and place. This theory was impossible to definitively disprove, and it remains a point of debate among some researchers. The racial politics of the case were explosive. Some black community leaders argued that if the victims had been white children from wealthy families, the investigation would have received more resources and would have been solved more quickly. This was probably true. The victims' families were working class or poor, with limited political power, and the initial police response was indeed slow and under-resourced. But once the investigation was fully underway, it consumed enormous resources. By 1981, the task force was one of the largest active criminal investigations in the country. Hundreds of investigators were assigned to the case. The FBI brought in behavioral analysts, forensic experts, data processing capabilities. Rewards totaling over $100,000 were offered for information leading to the killer. The problem was not lack of effort but lack of results. The investigation generated tens of thousands of leads, most of which went nowhere. Dozens of suspects were investigated intensively and cleared. The task force was drowning in information but starving for the one piece of evidence that would point to a specific person. And all the while, children continued to disappear and die. Parents in Black Atlanta lived in a nightmare where their children were being hunted and the authorities, despite their best efforts, could not protect them. Part 4: The Bridge and the Arrest. By the spring of 1981, the Atlanta child murders investigation had consumed more than a year and enormous resources without identifying a viable suspect. But the task force had developed theories about how and where the killer was disposing of bodies, and those theories would eventually lead to the break in the case. Many of the victims' bodies had been found in rivers or near rivers, the Chattahoochee River in particular. Investigators theorized that the killer might be disposing of bodies by throwing them from bridges into the water, relying on the current to carry them downstream where they would be less likely to connect to the point of disposal. Based on this theory, the task force organized surveillance of various bridges over the Chattahoochee River in late May 1981. Teams of agents and police officers were stationed near bridges, watching for anyone who might stop to throw something into the water during the late night or early morning hours when traffic was minimal. On the night of May 22, 1981, at approximately 2:52 a.m., an FBI agent named Greg Gilliland and an Atlanta police officer were stationed near the James Jackson Parkway Bridge over the Chattahoochee River. They heard a loud splash in the water beneath the bridge, the distinctive sound of something heavy being thrown or dropped into the river. They immediately moved to stop any vehicles that might be leaving the bridge. A white Chevrolet station wagon was spotted leaving the area. It was stopped, and the driver was questioned. His name was Wayne Bertram Williams, a 23-year-old black man who lived with his parents in northwest Atlanta. He told the officers he had been out looking for the address of Cheryl Johnson, a singer he was hoping to sign to his music promotion business. The officers found Williams's explanation plausible enough at the time. They noted his information and let him go. But the stop and questioning had been documented, and when Williams's name came up in the task force database as someone who had previously been questioned in connection with the case, investigators took a closer look. 2 days later, on May 24, 1981, the body of Nathaniel Cater, 27 years old, was pulled from the Chattahoochee River downstream from the James Jackson Parkway Bridge. He had been in the water for only a short time, and his death was determined to be from asphyxiation. Cater had last been seen alive on May 21, the day before the splash was heard from the bridge. The timing and location were too specific to be coincidental. Investigators began focusing intensively on Wayne Williams. Williams was an unusual figure. He lived with his parents in a modest house in northwest Atlanta. He called himself a music promoter and talent scout, though his actual success in the music industry was minimal. He drove around Atlanta with a police scanner and sometimes showed up at crime scenes or fires, claiming to be a freelance photographer or journalist. He was known to some police officers as a gadfly, someone who tried to insert himself into investigations, someone who wanted to be seen as important and connected. He also fit some aspects of the FBI's profile of the killer. He was black, which would explain why he could move through black neighborhoods without drawing attention. He was in his early 20s, the age range the profile had suggested. He had a car and the mobility to dump bodies in different locations. He was intelligent but underachieving, someone with grandiose aspirations and limited real accomplishment. Investigators obtained search warrants for Williams's home and car. The searches yielded numerous fibers from Williams's home carpet, from his bedspread, from his car, that would become the centerpiece of the forensic case against him. On June 21, 1981, Wayne Williams was arrested and charged with the murder of Nathaniel Cater. He was later also charged with the murder of Jimmy Ray Payne, another adult victim. He was never charged with any of the child murders, though prosecutors would present evidence linking him to those crimes during his trial for the Cater and Payne murders. Part 5. The Trial. Wayne Williams's trial for the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne began in January 1982 in Fulton County Superior Court before Judge Clarence Cooper. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Louis Slatton and his team. Williams was defended by Attorney Alvin Binder and a team of defense lawyers. The prosecution's case rested primarily on 3 elements: fiber evidence, witness testimony placing Williams with or near victims, and evidence of a pattern connecting Williams to multiple murders beyond just Cater and Payne. The fiber evidence was the most sophisticated forensic science that had ever been presented in a Georgia criminal trial. FBI forensic experts had analyzed fibers recovered from the bodies of multiple victims and compared them to fibers from Williams's home and car. They found matches to fibers from a carpet in Williams's home, an unusual yellow-green carpet made by the Wellman Corporation that was relatively rare. Fibers from a bedspread in Williams's bedroom. Fibers from the carpet in Williams's Chevrolet station wagon. Dog hairs consistent with the German Shepherd owned by Williams's family. The FBI experts testified that the combination of these different fiber types found on multiple victims was statistically very unlikely to be coincidental. The victims had been in environments that contained all these specific fiber types, and Williams's home and car were the only known locations where all these fiber types occurred together. The defense attacked the fiber evidence vigorously, arguing that fiber analysis was not an exact science. that the FBI's statistical calculations were flawed, and that the fibers could have been transferred to victims through secondary contact rather than direct contact with Williams. But the sheer number of fiber matches across multiple victims made the defense's position difficult. The prosecution also presented witnesses who testified to having seen Williams with some of the victims shortly before their disappearances. These witnesses were not always entirely credible. Some had criminal histories, some had given inconsistent statements, but their collective testimony created a circumstantial case that Williams had been in contact with at least some of the murdered individuals. Most controversially, the prosecution was allowed to present evidence linking Williams to 10 of the child murders. In addition to the 2 adult murders he was formally charged with. This pattern evidence was intended to show that Cater and Payne were part of a larger series of murders, all committed by the same person, and that this person was Williams. Judge Cooper's decision to allow this pattern evidence was controversial and would become a major point of appeal. Defense attorneys argued that Williams was effectively being tried for 12 murders while only being formally charged with 2, and that the prejudicial impact of the child murder evidence made a fair trial impossible. Williams himself testified in his own defense, denying any involvement in the murders. He explained his presence on the bridge the night of the splash as innocent. He was looking for an address, got lost, and happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He explained the fibers as the result of victims having been in other locations where similar fibers might be found, or as contamination during evidence handling. Williams's testimony was problematic for the defense. He came across as arrogant and evasive, failing to adequately explain several suspicious aspects of his behavior. His claim that he was looking for Cheryl Johnson's address at 2:52 a.m. was never substantiated. Cheryl Johnson testified that she had never arranged any meeting with Williams and had no knowledge of his alleged search for her. The trial lasted 2 months. The jury, consisting of 8 black jurors and 4 white jurors, deliberated for approximately 12 hours before returning a verdict on February 27, 1982, guilty on both counts of murder. Williams was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. In the aftermath of the conviction, the Atlanta Police Department officially closed 23 of the child murder cases, attributing them to Williams without ever formally charging him with those crimes. This decision to close the cases without trial remains controversial. Williams was never convicted of any child murder. The fiber evidence linking him to the child victims was presented during his trial for the adult murders, but he was never required to defend himself specifically against those charges in a separate proceeding. Families of some victims objected to the cases being closed, arguing that the evidence against Williams for their children's deaths was insufficient. Part 6: The Evidence and the Doubts. The case against Wayne Williams rested primarily on fiber evidence, a type of forensic science that was relatively new to criminal trials in 1982, and that has been both praised and questioned in the decades since. The FBI's fiber analysis was extensive and sophisticated. Forensic experts examined fibers recovered from the bodies of 12 victims and compared them to fibers from Williams's home and car. They found yellow-green carpet fibers from Williams's home on 10 victims, violet-colored fibers from Williams's bedroom on multiple victims, dog hairs consistent with Williams's family dog on several victims, carpet fibers from Williams's car on several victims. The FBI calculated that the probability of these fiber matches occurring by chance was vanishingly small, on the order of millions to 1 against. The argument was that the victims had been in Williams's home and car, had contact with his carpet and bedding, and had been in close enough proximity to his dog to pick up dog hairs. But fiber evidence has limitations that were not fully understood in 1982, and that have become more apparent with subsequent research and experience. First, fibers are transferred easily and can persist on clothing for long periods. A person could theoretically pick up fibers in one location and transfer them to another person or location without the two locations ever being connected. Second, fiber identification is not unique in the way that DNA or fingerprints are unique. A yellow-green carpet fiber from Williams's home is similar to other yellow-green carpet fibers of the same type, but it cannot be definitively proven to have come from Williams's specific carpet rather than another carpet of the same type. Third, the statistical calculations about the rarity of fiber combinations are based on assumptions about the independence of different fiber types and the randomness of fiber transfer, assumptions that may not hold in real-world conditions. The defense argued these points vigorously, but not successfully. The jury found the fiber evidence persuasive, particularly given the number of different fiber types and the number of victims on whom matching fibers were found. The witness testimony was more problematic. Several witnesses testified to seeing Williams with victims shortly before they disappeared, but many of these witnesses had credibility issues. Some had criminal records. Some had given inconsistent statements to police over time. Some came forward only after Williams's arrest, raising questions about whether their memories were genuine or influenced by media coverage and reward money. Some were children at the time of the events they were testifying about, testifying years later with uncertain memories. The most damaging witness testimony came from several young men who testified that Williams had made sexual advances toward them, establishing that Williams was attracted to young black males and sometimes offered them money or other inducements. This testimony was relevant to establishing motive and opportunity, but did not directly prove that Williams had killed anyone. The pattern evidence, the presentation of evidence linking Williams to 10 child murders in addition to the 2 he was charged with, was legally controversial but practically important. Without the pattern evidence, the case against Williams for Cater and Payne alone might have been weaker. With the pattern evidence, the jury could see Williams as a serial killer who had murdered repeatedly over 2 years, making the specific murders he was charged with more plausible. But this created a legal problem. Williams was convicted partly based on evidence of crimes he was never formally charged with and never had the opportunity to defend himself against in a focused way. This is a violation of traditional due process principles, though Georgia law at the time permitted pattern evidence in certain circumstances. The doubts about Williams's guilt fall into several categories. The KKK theory. Some investigators and researchers have argued that evidence pointing to Ku Klux Klan involvement was overlooked or suppressed. Witness statements described seeing victims with white men in vehicles. The pattern of targeting black children is consistent with racial terrorism, but the FBI found no credible evidence of Klan involvement. The multiple killer theory. Some believe that not all 28 victims were killed by the same person, that several different killers were operating in Atlanta during this period, and that attributing all the deaths to Williams was an oversimplification driven by the desire to close the cases. The insufficient evidence theory. Some argue that the evidence against Williams, while suspicious, was not sufficient for conviction beyond reasonable doubt, particularly for the child murders he was never formally tried for. The police misconduct theory. Some believe that police, under enormous pressure to solve the case, focused on Williams to the exclusion of other suspects and may have overlooked or suppressed evidence that didn't fit their theory. Williams himself has maintained his innocence consistently since his arrest in 1981. He has given numerous interviews from prison, has cooperated with defense investigators, and has never wavered in his claim that he is innocent, that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that the fiber evidence was either contaminated or misinterpreted. Part 7. The Aftermath and the REOPENED Investigation. After Wayne Williams's conviction in 1982, the city of Atlanta attempted to move forward from the trauma of the child murders. The cases were officially closed. Parents tried to rebuild their lives. The city resumed its trajectory of growth and development. But the wounds never fully healed. Families of victims who believed Williams was guilty found some closure but still carried the grief of their loss. Families who doubted Williams's guilt carried both grief and frustration, believing the real killer had never been caught. Williams was incarcerated at various Georgia prisons, serving his consecutive life sentences. He became eligible for parole consideration in 2007, but was denied. He has been denied at every subsequent parole hearing, most recently in 2022. From prison, Williams has consistently maintained his innocence. He has given interviews to journalists, has cooperated with filmmakers making documentaries about the case, and has urged continued investigation of the murders. He has particularly focused on the fact that he was never tried for the child murders, only for 2 adult murders, yet the child murder cases were closed based on his conviction. In 2019, Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms announced that the city would reopen the investigation into the Atlanta child murders, reviewing the evidence with modern forensic techniques, including DNA analysis. The announcement came after a CNN documentary series on the case raised questions about whether all the murders had really been solved. The reopened investigation focused on re-examining physical evidence from the crime scenes using DNA technology that didn't exist in the early 1980s. Hair samples, clothing, and other materials that had been preserved in evidence storage were submitted for DNA testing. The results have been mixed and incomplete. Some evidence has been too degraded to yield useful DNA profiles. Some DNA testing has produced profiles that don't match Williams, suggesting that other individuals may have had contact with victims. But no DNA evidence has definitively excluded Williams as the killer, and no DNA evidence has pointed to an alternative suspect. The reopened investigation also reviewed witness statements and tips that had been received over the decades. Some leads were followed up that had been overlooked or inadequately investigated in the original case. But as of 2024, no major breakthroughs have resulted from the reopened investigation. The case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and television series. The List 2000, a documentary film. Atlanta's Missing and Murdered, The Lost Children, 2020. A CNN series. Multiple books including James Baldwin's The Evidence of Things Not Seen, 1985, and Bernard Headley's The Atlanta Youth Murders and the Politics of Race, 1998. Each of these treatments has approached the case from different angles, some supporting Williams's guilt, some questioning it, some focusing on the racial and political context, some on the forensic evidence. The debate about Williams's guilt or innocence has become, in some respects, a proxy for broader debates about the criminal justice system, racial justice, and the reliability of forensic science. Those who believe Williams is guilty often point to the fiber evidence and the pattern of murders that stopped after his arrest. Those who believe he is innocent or that the case is not proven often point to the weakness of the witness testimony, the questionable decision to close cases he was never tried for, and the possibility that racial bias affected the investigation. What is undeniable is that 28 young people died during a horrific period in Atlanta's history, that their families have never received complete answers or full justice, and that significant questions about the case remain unresolved more than 40 years later. Part 8. Wayne WLLAMS, Who is he? Wayne Bertram Williams was born on May 27, 1958, in Atlanta, Georgia, to Homer and Faye Williams. He was an only child, raised in a modest but stable household in northwest Atlanta. His parents were both educators, his father a teacher and photographer, his mother a school teacher, and they encouraged Wayne's intellectual development from an early age. Wayne was a bright child, intellectually curious, with particular interests in electronics and broadcasting. He built his own radio station as a teenager, broadcasting from his parents' house with homemade equipment, calling himself a DJ and creating programs that he transmitted to a limited local audience. This early interest in broadcasting and media would become a defining feature of his identity. He attended Frederick Douglass High School and later briefly attended Georgia State University, though he didn't complete a degree. His focus was always on building his career in music promotion and broadcasting rather than on formal education. By his early 20s, Wayne had positioned himself as a music promoter and talent scout, claiming to be connected to major record labels and able to help aspiring singers get recording contracts. He would advertise for talent, hold auditions, and tell hopeful performers that he could get them into the music industry. The reality was that Wayne's connections and success were minimal at best and largely fabricated at worst. He had no legitimate contracts with major labels. The singers he claimed to be promoting never got recording deals through him. His talent agency was essentially a fantasy, a construction that allowed him to feel important and successful even though his actual achievements were negligible. This pattern, grandiose self-presentation with minimal underlying achievement, characterized much of Wayne's life. He drove around Atlanta with police scanners, showing up at crime scenes and fires, trying to insert himself into official activities as if he were a credentialed journalist or photographer. He was known to some police officers and firefighters as a gadfly, someone who wanted to be seen as important and connected, but who had no official role. Psychologically, Wayne presented as someone with narcissistic traits, an inflated sense of his own importance, a need for recognition and status, difficulty accepting criticism or failure. But he was also intelligent and capable in certain domains. His radio broadcasting work, while amateur, showed technical skill. His ability to navigate the city and present himself convincingly showed social intelligence. Whether Wayne was capable of the murders he was convicted of is a question that has been debated extensively. Those who believe in his guilt argue that his grandiosity and need for control could have expressed itself in violence against vulnerable young people. His access to a car and his mobility around the city gave him opportunity. His claimed interest in helping young aspiring musicians could have been a cover for luring victims. Those who believe in his innocence or doubt his guilt argue that Wayne showed no history of violence before the murders, that his personality traits, while problematic, don't necessarily predict serial killing, and that the evidence against him is circumstantial and questionable. The FBI behavioral analysts who studied the case believed that the killer would be someone who was intelligent but underachieving, living in the area and familiar with the neighborhoods where victims disappeared, black to avoid suspicion in black neighborhoods, likely to have a vehicle, possibly involved in some activity that gave him access to young people, possibly someone who inserted himself into the investigation or showed unusual interest in the cases. Wayne fit this profile remarkably well, which is why he became and remained the focus of the investigation once he came to police attention. But fitting a profile is not the same as being guilty, and the profile itself was based on assumptions about serial killer psychology that may or may not have been accurate. Since his conviction, Wayne has spent more than 40 years in prison. He has aged from a 23-year-old aspiring music promoter to a man in his mid-60s. His entire adult life spent behind bars for murders he continues to insist he did not commit. Part 9. The Racial Dimension. The racial context of the Atlanta child murders is inseparable from the case itself. Every victim was black. The murders occurred in a city that prided itself on racial progress, but where poverty and inequality were still sharply divided along racial lines. The investigation, the trial, and the ongoing debates about the case have all been shaped by race in fundamental ways. The initial slow response to the murders was almost certainly influenced by the victims' race and social class. If white children from wealthy families had been disappearing, the response would likely have been faster and more forceful. This is not to say that the police were deliberately negligent, but resource allocation and urgency in criminal investigations are influenced by victims' social status. And poor black children in early 1980s, Atlanta had less social status than white children from wealthier families. The theory that the Ku Klux Klan was responsible for the murders was taken seriously by many in Atlanta's black community, and with good reason. The Klan had a long history of racial terrorism in Georgia and throughout the South. The targeting of black children could have been understood as an extension of that terrorism, an attempt to intimidate and terrorize black communities. But the FBI investigated the KKK theory extensively and found no evidence to support it. No credible witness testimony placed Klan members with victims. No chatter in white supremacist circles suggested involvement. No claims of responsibility emerged. The Klan theory, while emotionally and historically resonant, did not match the evidence. The arrest and conviction of Wayne Williams, a black man, for the murders complicated the racial narrative. Some in the black community felt vindicated. The killer was not a white racist targeting black children, but a black predator from within the community. Others felt betrayed, believing that police had scapegoated a black man to protect white suspects or to close cases they couldn't solve. The composition of the jury, 8 black jurors and 4 white, was intended to ensure fairness, but also became a point of analysis. The fact that a majority black jury convicted Williams suggested that the evidence was compelling even to jurors who might have been skeptical of police and prosecution. But some critics argued that the jurors were influenced by political pressure to close the cases and end the terror that was paralyzing black Atlanta. The decision to close 23 child murder cases without ever charging Williams with those crimes was particularly controversial from a racial justice perspective. If Williams was guilty of those murders, why not charge him and put the evidence before a jury? If the evidence was insufficient to charge him, why close the cases and prevent further investigation? Some argued that the decision reflected a cynical calculation. The cases were closed to allow the city to move on, to restore Atlanta's image, to protect economic development and political careers. The victims' families, primarily working-class black families with limited political power, were not given the full accounting and justice they deserved. The reopening of the investigation in 2019 was partly driven by racial justice concerns. Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, an African-American woman, responded to community pressure and to the ongoing questions about the case by committing to new investigation using modern technology. The implicit acknowledgement was that the original investigation may not have served the victims' families adequately, and that the city owed them renewed effort. The case has also become a touchstone in discussions of how the criminal justice system treats black victims and black defendants. It raises questions about whether black lives are valued equally by police and prosecutors, whether black defendants receive fair trials, and whether forensic evidence is interpreted objectively or through racialized assumptions. These questions don't have simple answers, and different people evaluating the same evidence reach different conclusions based partly on their prior beliefs about the justice system and its treatment of race. What seems undeniable is that race shaped every aspect of the Atlanta child murders case, from the victim's vulnerability to the investigation's trajectory, to the ongoing debates about guilt and justice. Part 10. The Victims Families. The families of the 28 victims of the Atlanta child murders carried burdens that no family should have to carry. They lost children and siblings and cousins. They lived through years of fear and uncertainty. They endured investigations and media attention and political controversies. And most painfully, many never received complete answers about who killed their loved ones or why. Camille Bell, the mother of Yusef Bell, became the most prominent voice for the victims' families. After Yusef's body was found in the crawl space of an abandoned school, strangled and hidden, Camille channeled her grief into advocacy. She organized other mothers, demanded police attention, criticized the slow initial response to the murders, and refused to let the city ignore what was happening. Camille later wrote a book about her experience and her son. She became a national advocate for missing children and for justice in cases involving violence against children. She never fully accepted Wayne Williams's guilt, believing that significant questions remained unanswered and that other suspects had not been adequately investigated. Venus Taylor, the mother of Angel Lanier, carried the additional burden of knowing that her 12-year-old daughter had been sexually assaulted before being killed. The brutality of Angel's murder, tied to a tree, hands bound, was one of the most disturbing in the entire series. Venus struggled with substance abuse and mental health challenges in the aftermath of Angel's death, a common pattern among parents who have lost children to violence. The families of the children who were never found, Jeffrey Mathies, LaTanya Wilson, Darren Glass, faced a particularly agonizing form of grief. They had no bodies to bury, no graves to visit, no physical confirmation of death, even though the passage of time made survival increasingly implausible. The uncertainty, the inability to complete the rituals of mourning, the faint, impossible hope that maybe their child was still alive somewhere, these added layers to an already unbearable loss. Some families found some measure of closure in Wayne Williams's conviction. They believed the evidence against him, believed justice had been served, and were able to move forward with their grieving knowing that the killer was in prison. But even for these families, the closure was incomplete. Williams was never tried for the child murders. He maintains his innocence. The possibility that he might someday be exonerated, however remote, means the wound can never fully heal. Other families never believed Williams was guilty, or believed the evidence was insufficient to be certain. For them, the closing of the cases was a betrayal, an official abandonment of the search for truth. They wanted additional investigation, wanted other suspects pursued, wanted a trial that would air all the evidence rather than a conviction based on fiber analysis and pattern evidence. The economic impact on families was also severe. Many of the victims' parents were working class or poor, already struggling financially. The costs of funerals, of time off work to participate in investigations and trials, of legal fees for some families who hired attorneys to represent their interests. These costs created financial hardship on top of emotional devastation. The community support for families varied. Some received substantial help from churches, community organizations, and charitable donations. Others felt isolated, forgotten once the immediate media attention faded. The inequality in how different families were treated, partly based on their own social networks, partly on the particular visibility of their child's case, added to the sense of injustice. In the decades since the murders, the families have formed their own community, supporting each other, gathering on anniversaries, advocating together for continued investigation. This community has been both a source of strength and a reminder of shared trauma that can never be fully escaped. The children who survived, siblings of victims, friends who witnessed the terror, young people who grew up during Atlanta's season of fear, carry their own trauma. They lost brothers and sisters. They grew up knowing that playing outside could mean death. They watched their parents grieve. They learned lessons about vulnerability and danger that no child should have to learn. The intergenerational impact of the Atlanta child murders continues. Children and grandchildren of victims grow up knowing their family history, carrying the weight of losses that occurred before they were born. The case is part of Atlanta's history, part of Black Atlanta's collective memory, a wound that has scarred the community permanently. Part 11, where the case stands today. As of 2024, Wayne Williams remains in prison, serving consecutive life sentences for the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. He is 66 years old, has spent 43 years behind bars, and continues to maintain his innocence. His most recent parole hearing was in 2022, and he was denied parole. He will be eligible for another parole hearing in 2027. The 23 child murder cases that were closed in 1982 after Williams's conviction remain officially closed, though the city's 2019 decision to reopen the investigation technically allows for new evidence to be considered. No major developments have emerged from the reopened investigation as of this writing, though analysis of some evidence is still ongoing. Several key questions remain unresolved. Question 1. Did Wayne Williams kill all 28 victims? The official position of the Atlanta Police Department is that Williams was responsible for most or all of the murders, but Williams was only convicted of 2 adult murders and never tried for any child murders. The fiber evidence links him to several victims but not to all of them. It is possible that he killed some victims but not others, or even that he killed none of them and was wrongly convicted. Question 2. Were there other killers? Some researchers believe that multiple killers were operating in Atlanta during 1970 91981, and that attributing all 28 deaths to one person oversimplified a more complex reality. Differences in victim age, cause of death, and disposal location suggest possible variation in perpetrators. But the fiber evidence linking multiple victims to Williams's home and car argues against completely independent killings. Question 3. Was the KKK or other white supremacist group involved? The FBI found no credible evidence of Klan involvement despite extensive investigation. But some witnesses reported seeing victims with white men in vehicles, and the racial pattern of the murders is consistent with racial terrorism. Whether these witness accounts were accurate and whether they were adequately investigated remains debated. Question 4. Was evidence suppressed or ignored? Some defense investigators and critics of the prosecution believe that evidence pointing to other suspects was overlooked or suppressed, that the task force focused on Williams to the exclusion of other leads once he became a suspect. The prosecution maintains that all credible leads were investigated and that the evidence against Williams was overwhelming. Question 5. Will DNA evidence provide definitive answers? The 2019 reopened investigation included DNA testing of preserved evidence. Some testing has been completed, but much evidence has been too degraded to yield useful results. DNA profiles that don't match Williams have been found on some evidence, but whether these represent contamination, secondary transfer, or evidence of other perpetrators is unclear. As of 2024, no DNA evidence has definitively proven Williams's guilt or innocence. The legal status of the case is complex. Williams's conviction stands. Upheld through multiple appeals. The Georgia Supreme Court affirmed the conviction, and federal courts have denied habeas corpus petitions. Short of new evidence that definitively proves his innocence or prosecutorial misconduct, Williams's conviction is unlikely to be overturned. But public opinion remains divided. Some believe Williams is clearly guilty, that the fiber evidence is compelling, and that the pattern of murders stopping after his arrest confirms his responsibility. Others believe he is innocent or that the case against him was not proven beyond reasonable doubt, and that he has been wrongly imprisoned for more than 40 years. The cultural legacy of the case persists. In Atlanta, particularly in the Black community, the Atlanta child murders remain a defining trauma, a period that shaped a generation's understanding of vulnerability and safety. Parents who lived through the terror pass those memories to their children. The case is taught in schools, discussed in community centers, memorialized in public events. Nationally, the case is remembered as one of the most significant unsolved or contested serial killer cases in American history. It appears regularly in true crime media, each treatment offering different perspectives on Williams's guilt or innocence, and on the broader social and racial context of the murders. For the families of victims, the passage of time has not brought complete healing. Some have found peace through faith, through activism, through building lives that honor their lost loved ones. Others continue to struggle with grief and with the unresolved questions about justice. All carry the burden of loss that can never be fully addressed by any legal outcome. Part 12. Final Aria Felicitiones. The Atlanta child murders case resists simple conclusions. It is simultaneously a story of genuine investigative achievement, a massive task force that eventually made an arrest and secured a conviction, and a story of possible injustice, of questions left unanswered, of families never given complete closure. 28 young people died. This is the irreducible fact at the center of everything. Edward Smith, Alfred Evans, Milton Harvey, Yusef Bell, Angel Lenner, Jeffrey Mathis, Eric Middlebrooks, Christopher Richardson, LaTanya Wilson, Aaron Witch, Anthony Carter, Earl Terrell, Clifford Jones, Darren Glass, Charles Stevens, Aaron Witch, Anthony Carter, Patrick Rogers, Luby Getter, Terry Pugh, Patrick Baltazar, Curtis Walker, Joseph Bell, Timothy Hill, Eddie Duncan, Larry Rogers, Michael McIntosh, Jimmy Ray Payne, William Barrett. These names deserve to be remembered, spoken, honored. They were children and young adults with futures that were stolen. Some were 9 years old, some were 23, most were in between. They came from Atlanta's Black neighborhoods, from working class and poor families, from communities that deserved protection they didn't receive. Wayne Williams has spent 43 years in prison for murders he insists he did not commit. If he is guilty, justice has been served, and his imprisonment has protected society from a dangerous predator. If he is innocent, a profound injustice has been committed, a man's entire adult life taken for crimes he did not do. The evidence against Williams is substantial but not definitive. The fiber evidence is compelling but not conclusive. The witness testimony is suggestive but problematic. The pattern evidence is powerful but legally questionable. Reasonable people evaluating the same evidence reach different conclusions. What seems clear is that the investigation, while massive and sincere, was imperfect. Leads were missed. Evidence was contaminated or lost. Witnesses were unreliable. The pressure to solve the case was enormous, and that pressure may have influenced how evidence was interpreted and which theories were pursued. The racial dimension of the case cannot be separated from any analysis. The victims were Black children from poor communities. The initial response was slower than it should have been. The suspect who was eventually arrested and convicted was also Black, complicating narratives of racial justice and injustice. The case became a flashpoint for debates about how the criminal justice system serves or fails Black communities. The families of victims deserve more than they received. They deserved faster initial response. They deserved complete investigation of all possible suspects. They deserved trials that would air all evidence rather than convictions that closed cases without full accounting. Whether they received justice depends on whether Williams is guilty, and that question remains genuinely contested. The lesson from the Atlanta child murders is not simple or comfortable. It is not that the police always get it right or always get it wrong. It is not that forensic science is perfectly reliable or completely unreliable. It is not that racial justice is served or denied in any straightforward way. The lesson is that even massive investigations with enormous resources can leave fundamental questions unanswered. That criminal justice is human and therefore imperfect, subject to the limitations of evidence and technology and human judgment. That families of victims carry burdens that no legal outcome can fully address. That communities traumatized by violence bear scars that persist across generations. The Atlanta